One afternoon, everything changed. Her old college friend Alina came back to town. Elegant, rich, glowing, the kind of woman people turned to look at. They hadn't met in years, but when she hugged her, the wife felt a strange chill. Alina was kind, but there was a quiet arrogance behind every smile. Her husband noticed her too, and for the first time in months his eyes lit up again, not for his wife, but for her friend. That night, while she washed dishes, she replayed every glance she saw at dinner. The way he laughed at Alina's jokes, the way he asked about her travels, how his tone changed completely. It hurt, but she stayed silent. Love teaches patience, but sometimes patience becomes a slow poison. Days turned into weeks and things began to shift. He started dressing better, coming home late, always with excuses. She waited at the door every night, holding dinner in hope. But the hope was dying faster than her smile. Then one day she found a gift in his jacket, a gold bracelet, too expensive for their life, too elegant for her style. Her heart froze. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Silence became her answer. Soon after, he began comparing. Her clothes, her habits, even her laughter. "You never change," he muttered one night, and she realized he didn't want her to anymore. Then came the day he walked out. No fight, no tears from him, just words that tore through her chest. "I'm not happy here," that's all he left. She stood at the door, the world quiet, her breath heavy, trying to understand how love can turn into nothing so easily. People whispered, neighbors stared, but she didn't break. For weeks she sat in darkness, trying to remember where she went wrong. But grief slowly turned into resolve. She promised herself that she wouldn't stay broken forever. Life had taken everything from her, but not her strength. So she got up. Step by step she rebuilt. She took small jobs, started learning again, fought back against every memory that tried to pull her down. Time passed and pain turned into purpose. The world had mocked her for being poor, but soon they would learn. Gold doesn't shine brighter than a kind heart. Meanwhile, her ex-husband's dream wasn't the paradise he imagined. Alina, the woman he had chosen, was rich, but her love came with conditions. She reminded him daily that he was lucky she accepted him. What once felt like adventure now felt like a cage. He smiled for the world but regretted every moment in private. And while he sank into a life built on pride, the woman he left behind began to rise. Life rewarded her not with sudden luck, but with quiet chances. A business event, a kind investor, a door that opened because of her honesty. People began to notice her humility, her grace. Among them was a man of power and peace, a billionaire known for helping those who deserved it. He saw something in her, not beauty, not luxury, but strength. Slowly she entered a life she never imagined, not by chasing wealth, but by walking with dignity. 5 years passed. Then one night, destiny brought all three together. A charity gala, bright lights, cameras flashing. Across the hall, her ex-husband froze. Alina's face went pale, because walking in that hall, dressed with quiet elegance, was the same woman they once abandoned. But this time she wasn't alone. Her hand rested in the arm of the billionaire everyone respected. The room turned to look, whispers spreading fast. The husband couldn't breathe. The wife, now a symbol of grace, met his eyes once, and in that single glance he felt every mistake. She smiled faintly, not with pride, not revenge, but peace. The pain she once carried had shaped her into something unbreakable. Yet deep down a quiet ache remained, a reminder that even when you win, some wounds never truly fade. The nights after he left felt endless. She would sit on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty side where he once slept. The silence was louder than any fight they ever had. Every object in that small apartment carried a memory. The cup he used, the chair where he'd read the newspaper, the jacket still hanging by the door. Each one whispered a story of love that no longer existed. For weeks she couldn't eat properly. Her neighbors spoke in hushed tones, their pity cutting deeper than their words. Some said she was foolish for loving too much. Others said she should have seen it coming. But they didn't know what it meant to build a life on faith, to believe that love could survive everything. One morning she looked at her reflection in the mirror, pale, tired, eyes swollen from tears, and realized no one was coming to save her. That realization broke her, but also set her free. She decided to start again. The first step was painful, leaving the apartment they had shared. It carried too many ghosts. She rented a smaller place near the edge of the city, A one-room space with peeling paint and leaky taps. But it was hers. It was a beginning. She took whatever work she could find, typing, assisting, sometimes cleaning offices late at night. People who once looked down on her now ignored her, and strangely that made it easier. She no longer owed anyone explanations. Months passed. Life didn't suddenly get better, but it got quieter. In that quiet, she began to hear her own strength. Every morning she woke before dawn. Every night she fell asleep exhausted. But each day the pain hurt a little less. One evening, while returning from work, she saw a couple laughing by the roadside. The woman leaned on the man's shoulder, and for a moment something twisted inside her. Not jealousy, but remembrance. That used to be her once, trusting, hopeful. Now love felt like a dream she had outgrown. But fate has a strange way of working. It never warns before it turns. One afternoon, her office was asked to handle a last-minute corporate event. She had been working as a part-time coordinator, quiet, efficient, unnoticed. That day, she was assigned to manage seating arrangements for a charity dinner hosted by one of the country's most influential business figures, a billionaire known for his silence more than his power. She didn't think much of it. She was just there to do her job. But sometimes destiny hides in ordinary moments. The event was grand. Marble floors, golden chandeliers, people in suits. She moved quietly between tables, checking placements, fixing details. Then, while arranging name cards, someone accidentally bumped into her. She dropped everything. A calm voice said, "Are you all right?" When she looked up, her breath caught. It was him, the host, the billionaire everyone whispered about. But his eyes weren't cold or arrogant like she imagined. They were steady, kind, and unexpectedly gentle. She quickly nodded, embarrassed. "I'm fine, sir." He helped her pick up the cards, something no one of his status would normally do, and before leaving he said softly, "You have a patient way of doing things. Don't lose that." The words were simple, but they lingered. In a world that had broken her, someone had finally seen her again. Not as a failure, but as a person. The next week, her company was again hired for one of his events. He remembered her. Each time their interactions were brief, professional, but they left ripples in her heart. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pity her, and that alone made her feel safe. Over months, small talks turned into conversations about books, about resilience, about how life tests people in silence. He once said, "The strongest hearts are often the quietest," and for the first time in years she smiled, not because she was happy, but because someone finally understood her. Still, she never imagined anything beyond friendship. He was a man from a different world, one built on success and power. She was just someone trying to survive, but destiny was already moving quietly behind the scenes. One evening, after a late meeting, he offered her a ride home. She hesitated but accepted. During the drive, rain began pouring heavily. The city lights blurred outside, and he said almost to himself, "Do you know why storms don't scare me anymore? Because they remind me of everything I've survived." She looked at him, and for the first time felt peace in someone's presence. That night, when she returned home, she didn't cry. She simply sat by the window, listening to the rain, realizing that maybe, just maybe, some endings are really beginnings in disguise. The months that followed moved like gentle waves, not fast, not loud, but steady. Every few weeks she'd find herself crossing paths with him again, sometimes at events, sometimes at quiet meetings. He was different from everyone she'd known, calm in chaos, kind without reason. He never spoke of power, yet people around him moved carefully, respecting his silence more than any order. For her, those brief conversations were like sunlight through clouds. He never pitied her, never asked about her pain, and that became its own kind of healing. One afternoon, as the event ended and guests left, she stayed behind to help clear the hall. He noticed, walked toward her and said quietly, "You do more than what's expected." "That's rare." She smiled softly and replied, "Maybe that's all I've ever known, trying harder than needed." He didn't answer, but his eyes said enough. From that day, she began receiving small responsibilities directly from his office. At first it felt strange, being trusted again. But she gave her best, pouring her discipline and patience into every task. Within months, her position changed. She wasn't just assisting anymore. She was managing projects, leading small teams. Colleagues who once ignored her began noticing. Slowly, the woman who once cried herself to sleep began walking with quiet confidence. Still, she remained grounded. Success didn't erase her scars. It simply gave them purpose. Late at night, she often remembered the past, not with tears but with calm acceptance. Life had been cruel, but it had also been fair. It had broken her only to rebuild her differently. The billionaire continued to appear like a silent guardian, never too close, never too far. Sometimes during meetings she'd catch him watching her while she spoke, not with admiration but with pride. It felt strange to be seen that way again. One evening, during a charity campaign, she was invited to dinner with a few senior staff. She hesitated, she wasn't used to luxury, but he personally asked her to attend. The restaurant was elegant, filled with warm lights and quiet music. As they discussed plans, he suddenly said, "You've changed since the first time we met." She looked surprised, unsure what to say. "You looked at the floor then. Now you look people in the eye." She smiled faintly, realizing how far she'd come. After dinner, as they walked out, the city lights reflected off the glass towers around them. He said almost softly, "You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who refused to give up even when everything was gone." There was something in his tone, not romance but memory. She didn't ask. Some silences are better left untouched. From that day on, their bond deepened, built on mutual respect, not need. He began sharing parts of his own story. A late wife, years of loneliness, battles no one saw. For the first time, she realized that even the most powerful people carried invisible wounds. In his honesty, she found peace. In her resilience, he found reflection. Together, they began to create something more than friendship, a quiet companionship that needed no words. The city around them moved fast, but they built a small world of stillness. Over time, people began to notice. Rumors whispered, an ordinary woman close to a billionaire, but he never explained, never corrected. Instead, he gave her a place by his side at every event, introducing her as his most trusted person. It wasn't romance in the beginning. It was something purer. Yet destiny doesn't ask for permission before shifting paths. One winter evening, as the city lights shimmered on wet streets, he fell ill during a conference. She rushed to help, staying by his side for hours. When he opened his eyes, she was still there, holding water for him. "You should rest," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I haven't felt cared for like this in years." That moment changed everything. He began to see her not as an employee, but as the missing calm he had searched for. Their bond grew quietly, unspoken but undeniable. Soon he asked her to accompany him on a charity project abroad, a trip that changed everything. In those few days, watching her interact with children, seeing her kindness in action, he realized she wasn't just strong, she was extraordinary. When they returned, he didn't hide his feelings. "Life rarely gives second chances," he said one evening, "but sometimes it gives better ones." She looked away, unsure how to respond. Love wasn't something she trusted anymore. But this was different, not burning passion, but gentle certainty. Over months, what began as gratitude turned into affection. And one morning, under soft sunrise light, he asked her a question that brought tears to her eyes. "Will you walk beside me, not as someone I help, but as someone I cherish?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought of her past, her scars, her fears. But then she remembered the woman who refused to break. With trembling hands, she nodded. In that moment, her life quietly turned. The girl once abandoned for being poor was now stepping into a world of power, not because she chased wealth, but because destiny finally caught up with her worth. The day she became his wife, the world finally looked at her differently. Cameras flashed, newspapers wrote headlines, people whispered her name with awe. The same voices that once mocked her now called her lucky, but they didn't know the story behind those quiet eyes. She wasn't lucky. She was rebuilt by pain, forged by heartbreak. Standing beside the billionaire everyone admired, she wore grace like armor. Their wedding was elegant but small. No grand ballroom, no 1,000 guests, just a few close friends, soft music, and eyes that spoke more than vows. When he held her hand and said, "You've given peace back to my life," tears filled hers. For years she had begged life for mercy. Now life was finally bowing to her strength. But even as love found her again, a part of her remained guarded. Nights in the mansion often felt surreal. Chandeliers, marble halls, gardens glowing with golden lights. A world she once only saw from a distance. She was respected, adored, even envied. Yet when she looked in the mirror, sometimes she still saw the woman who once stood alone with tears in her eyes and a broken heart in her hands. Her new husband understood that silence. He never asked her to forget, only to live again. We can't erase the past, he told her once, but we can make it smaller by building something bigger ahead. And slowly, she began to believe him. Their bond wasn't about glitter or grand gestures. It was about peace. Morning coffee in the garden, walks by the lake, simple laughter that didn't demand perfection. Still, every now and then, shadows returned. Sometimes a familiar perfume would drift by, or a song would play from the old days and her heart would pause. The past had left fingerprints that time couldn't wash away. But she learned not to run from it. She carried it quietly, like a scar that reminded her of how far she had come. The world around her was different now. Lavish parties, charity galas, people trying to impress her. She smiled politely, but deep down she stayed humble. She knew what it meant to have nothing. That memory became her strength. Soon she began using her position for purpose. She launched foundations for struggling women, those left behind, betrayed or forgotten. Each face she helped reminded her of her old self. The media began calling her the woman with a golden heart. But she never chased titles, she only wanted meaning. One day, while reviewing charity proposals, she saw a name that made her breath stop. Alina. The same woman who had once taken everything from her. Her hands trembled slightly as she read. Alina was requesting funding for a failing venture. Curiosity mixed with pain. Years had passed, but that name still echoed like thunder in her chest. She didn't respond immediately. That night, as she sat by the window watching city lights, her husband noticed her quietness. "Something on your mind?" he asked gently. She nodded. "A ghost from the past," he didn't press. "Some truths are better spoken when hearts are ready." Days later, she signed the approval. Not out of pity, but closure. She didn't need revenge. The greatest victory was peace. Time flowed gently after that. Her husband's trust grew, her influence expanded, and her world finally felt safe. Yet destiny, ever patient, was preparing the moment where her past and present would collide. Because one evening, at a grand gala celebrating global philanthropists, their paths would cross again. She didn't know it yet, but the night was already written. The ballroom shimmered with light. Powerful men, glamorous women, every camera turned toward her and her husband. As they entered, whispers filled the air. She walked gracefully, unaware that among the crowd stood two familiar figures, her ex-husband and Alina. They had come as guests, invited by another organization. When he saw her across the hall, laughter died in his throat. His glass slipped slightly in his hand. Alina's smile froze. The woman they had once abandoned was now standing on a stage built by her own courage, beside a man they could never compare to. The ex-husband's heart sank as he saw what he had thrown away, the dignity, the kindness, the soul he once called his own. Alina, once proud, stood silent, realizing that money without peace is nothing. The music slowed, the lights dimmed, and her name was announced as the evening's guest of honor. Applause filled the room. She stepped forward, calm, graceful, every step echoing with years of silent struggle. For a brief moment, her eyes met his. It wasn't anger that looked back. It was something far heavier, forgiveness. And forgiveness hurts more than hate. He looked down, ashamed. That night, she spoke about strength, kindness, and how pain can either destroy or define you. Her words silenced the room. By the time she finished, there were tears in more eyes than hers. As she returned to her seat, her husband gently took her hand. She looked at him, realizing that fate had brought her through fire not to burn her, but to shape her into the woman she was meant to be. Still, as the crowd applauded deep inside, she knew one truth. No amount of applause could erase the echo of the love that once betrayed her. Some scars never fade. They only learn to shine in silence. The gala ended, but the moment stayed with everyone. That night, as guests whispered and screens flashed her speech, she sat quietly in the car beside her husband. Outside, the city lights blurred like memories, distant, beautiful, untouchable. He looked at her, sensing the storm behind her calm eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. I think I finally am." But deep down her heart trembled, and not from pain but release. For years she had imagined what she'd do if she ever met them again. Anger, confrontation, maybe even tears. Yet when the moment came, all she felt was distance. It was strange, almost merciful. Pain had no power left over her. The next few days, news of her grace spread everywhere. Articles praised her humility, the elegance with which she handled the encounter, but she avoided reading any of it. She didn't want her past turned into a headline. Life had already written enough stories on her soul. Still, fate wasn't done. A week later, as she visited one of her charity centers, she overheard a staff member mention a bankruptcy filing. The name was familiar, Alina's company. Within months of trying to grow too fast, everything had collapsed. Investors pulled out, debts piled up, and suddenly the woman who once laughed in luxury was facing public shame. Her ex-husband wasn't spared either. He had invested heavily in her ventures, losing everything. The empire of pride they built on betrayal had crumbled under its own weight. For a moment she sat in silence. There was no joy in hearing it. Instead, she felt a strange sadness, not for them, but for what greed can do to people. Her husband noticed her quietness that evening and asked, "You heard about them?" She nodded. "Yes," he looked at her carefully. "And how does it make you feel?" She took a long breath before answering. "Lighter, not because they fell, but because I don't need to carry their story anymore." He smiled gently, proud of the woman she had become. Days turned into weeks. One afternoon, as she was leaving an event, a familiar figure appeared at the gate at her ex-husband. Time had changed him. The confident man she once knew looked older, smaller, almost fragile. Security moved to stop him, but she raised her hand. "Let him come." He walked slowly, eyes lowered. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said softly, "I don't deserve to even stand here. But I had to say this once, I'm sorry." His voice broke. "I thought money meant happiness. I thought she was everything I needed. But when everything vanished, I realized you were the only person who ever stood beside me without wanting anything in return." Tears welled in his eyes, but she didn't cry. She simply looked at him, not with anger, not even pity, but peace. "We were both different people then," she said gently. "You made your choice, and maybe if you hadn't, I wouldn't have found mine." He lowered his gaze, whispering, "You're right. I don't expect forgiveness." She shook her head slowly. "It's already given." That stunned him. Forgiveness was the one thing he never expected. It felt heavier than punishment. As he turned to leave, she added quietly, "Take care of yourself. You'll find peace one day, but only when you stop chasing what doesn't matter." He nodded silently and walked away, his figure fading into the city crowd. For the first time in years, her heart felt weightless. It wasn't revenge that freed her. It was letting go. Later that night, sitting with her husband on the balcony, she told him about the encounter. He listened quietly, then said, "You did what most can't. You turned pain into purpose." She smiled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what love was meant to do. Not break us, but teach us how strong we can be." The wind carried her words across the quiet sky. Somewhere below, the city pulsed with noise, deals, dreams, desires. But in that high-rise balcony, peace finally lived where pain once did. Weeks later, as winter turned to spring, she visited the same small cafe where she used to cry years ago. It looked different now, newer, brighter, but the seat by the window was still the same. She ordered the same tea, sat quietly, and smiled. The girl who once sat there with broken hopes was gone. In her place sat a woman who had walked through fire and learned to dance in its light. As she left the cafe, a little girl ran past her chasing a butterfly. For some reason, that sight made her heart swell. Life had come full circle, from tears to triumph, from loss to love. And maybe that was the real meaning of destiny, not rewriting the past, but giving it a reason. Years passed, quietly and kindly. Time, once her enemy, had now become her gentle friend. The woman who once cried in loneliness now spent her mornings surrounded by laughter. Not the loud kind, but the peaceful kind that fills a home with light. Her husband had grown older, his hair now silver, his voice slower. But his eyes still carried the same warmth that once saved her from darkness. Together they built more than a life. They built meaning. Every year she opened new programs for women rebuilding from nothing. She sat with them, listened to their stories, and every time she saw a trembling voice finding courage again, she saw her own reflection. Pain had taught her empathy, and empathy had turned her into a guide for others. She never spoke of her past in public, not because she was ashamed, but because true strength doesn't need to announce itself. Still, sometimes at night, when the city lights dimmed and silence covered the sky, memories would visit her gently. The young version of herself, broken, betrayed, lost, would stand at the edge of her thoughts, and she would smile, whispering softly, "You made it." In those quiet conversations with her own shadow, she found peace deeper than any applause. One evening, as she and her husband sat by the sea, watching waves crash softly against the rocks, he said, "You know, I used to think success was about control, money, power, achievements, but watching you taught me something else." She looked at him curiously. He smiled. "True success is the ability to stay kind after life has been cruel." His words settled in her heart like a final truth. She reached for his hand and held it gently. "And maybe love," she whispered, "isn't about finding perfection, but finding peace." He nodded, his eyes glistening. The sky turned gold and the sea shimmered like memory. That evening became one of those moments people never forget, not because of what was said, but because of what was felt. In the months that followed, her story spread quietly, through people she had helped, through lives she had touched. They called her many things, and strong, wise, inspiring, but she knew she was just someone who refused to give up when the world told her to. One day a journalist asked her, "If you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?" She smiled and said, "Don't fear heartbreak. Sometimes the door that slams in your face is the one that pushes you toward destiny." The answer went viral. Millions shared it, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Everyone who had ever been betrayed felt seen in her words. Everyone who had ever lost something found hope in her calm. But for her, it wasn't about fame, it was about faith. She believed that every soul had its own path through fire, and that no pain was wasted if it taught compassion. As years went by, her husband's health began to fade. It was quiet, slow and gentle, like the setting of a sun that had shone long enough. On his final night, he took her hand and whispered, "Promise me one thing, don't stop living when I'm gone. The world still needs your light." Tears slipped down her face as she held his hand tightly. "You were the light," she whispered. He smiled weakly. "No, you were." And with that he closed his eyes. The house felt empty after that, but not hollow. His love lingered like sunlight through a window, warm even when unseen. She continued her work, not as a widow, but as a woman who carried love like legacy. Every smile she gave, every hand she helped, felt like a piece of him living on. On her 60th birthday, surrounded by people whose lives she had changed, she looked at the sea once more, the same sea where they once sat, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you to the pain, the betrayal, the journey, the love. Because without any of it, she would never have become who she was." That night she wrote a single note in her journal. "Life doesn't always give you what you want, but it always gives you what you need to become who you're meant to be." She closed the book, smiled, and for the first time in her life, she felt complete. The poor wife, who was once abandoned for being less, had lived long enough to see that real wealth is not in diamonds or mansions. It's in the peace that money can't buy, in the kindness that pain can't kill, and in the strength that betrayal can't break. Sometimes, the people who break you are only there to wake you, so you can finally meet the life you were meant to live.